Peering behind the glass and crossing into uncharted territory, we aim to bring you closer to the absolute truth. Step into the past to witness the exact moments that shattered expectations.
Turn around and face me when I'm talking to you.
I have complied with every instruction.
Compliance doesn't explain how you're riding around in a car like this out here. Don't play games with me. People from where you're from don't usually end up behind the wheel of something like that.
On a quiet Sunday morning in rural Osceola County, Florida, a silver Mercedes SUV moved steadily down a two-lane highway lined with oak trees and open pasture. The windows were up, the air conditioning hummed softly, and a jazz station played through the speakers at low volume. Behind the wheel sat Judge Barbara Johnson, 53 years old, dressed in a casual linen blouse and slacks, sunglasses resting on the bridge of her nose, both hands relaxed on the wheel. She was heading south to visit her elderly mother at a nursing facility 40 minutes outside the city, a drive she made nearly every Sunday when her schedule allowed. There was nothing unusual about the morning, nothing out of place, just a woman on an empty road with nowhere to be in a hurry. What most people on that highway wouldn't have known, what the man in the cruiser 200 yards behind her certainly didn't know, was that Barbara Johnson had spent the last 22 years serving as a federal judge for the Southern District of Florida. She had graduated top of her class at Harvard Law, spent 8 years as a federal prosecutor handling cartel cases and public corruption trials, and was appointed to the bench by the President of the United States. Her Senate confirmation had been unanimous. In more than 2 decades on the bench, she had presided over drug trafficking conspiracies, civil rights cases, police misconduct lawsuits, and organized crime prosecutions that had reshaped how federal law was enforced across the state. She was one of the most respected jurists in Florida and among the most senior black women in the federal judiciary. But on that road, in that moment, none of that existed. She was just a black woman driving a nice car through a county where that alone was enough to draw attention. Sheriff Bo Harkin, 51, had been the head of the Osceola County Sheriff's Office for 11 years. Elected 3 times, each campaign built on the same promise: law and order, no exceptions, no apologies. He was a large man with a deep tan, a pressed uniform, and a voice that carried across rooms like it was built for commands. Residents who supported him called him tough. Residents who had been on the wrong side of his authority called him something else entirely. Beneath the surface of his carefully maintained public image sat a record that should have ended his career years ago. Over the course of his tenure, 47 formal complaints had been filed against his department for racial profiling and discriminatory traffic enforcement. Black and Latino drivers were stopped at nearly 5 times the rate of white drivers on county roads. 2 years earlier, the Department of Justice had opened a preliminary inquiry into his office's practices. It was quietly settled before a federal consent decree could be imposed. Harkin called it a misunderstanding. Civil rights attorneys called it a cover-up. Every Sunday, Harkin drove his cruiser through the county personally, a habit he described to reporters as keeping eyes on my county. In practice, it meant he patrolled the same stretches of road, watched the same intersections, and made the same kind of stops he'd been making for over a decade. That morning, he was parked at a crossroads near mile marker 14 when the silver Mercedes passed him heading south. Tinted windows, clean paint, a black woman behind the wheel. Harkin ran the plates. The registration came back clean. No warrants, no flags, no reason to stop. He pulled out behind her anyway. Half a mile later, the blue and red lights flashed in her rearview mirror. Barbara checked her speed. She was doing 53 in a 55. She signaled, eased the Mercedes onto the gravel shoulder, put the car in park, and turned the jazz down. Then she did what she had done at every traffic stop since she was 16 years old, something her father had taught her long before she ever set foot in a courtroom. She rolled the window down, placed both hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, and waited. She didn't reach for her purse. She didn't open the glove box. She didn't move. 22 years as a federal judge, and she still followed the same survival routine every black driver in America learns before they learn how to merge onto a highway. Harkin approached the driver's side slowly, one hand resting near his belt. His body camera was active, the small red light blinking against his chest. He leaned down, looked into the car, and looked at her. He didn't ask for license and registration. Instead, he asked, "Whose car is this?" Barbara kept her hands on the wheel. "It's mine." "Where are you headed?" "To visit my mother. She's in a care facility south of here." "Where are you coming from?" "My home, in Orlando." He paused, eyes scanning the interior of the vehicle, the leather seats, the garment bag in the back, the center console. "What are you doing in this part of the county?" Barbara answered evenly, "Driving, sir." "On a public road?" Harkin didn't respond to that. He took her license and registration, which she had removed from her purse slowly and with both hands visible, and walked back to his cruiser. He sat there for over 4 minutes. When he returned, he handed the documents back without a word about their validity. Instead, he said, "Your window tint looks illegal. I'm going to need to investigate further." The tint was factory standard, installed by the dealership the day the car was purchased. It met every requirement under Florida Statute 316.2953. Barbara knew this. She also knew what was actually happening. Harkin stepped back from the window and squared his shoulders. "Step out of the vehicle." Barbara looked at him. "May I ask why?" "You don't need to ask why. I gave you a lawful order. Step out." She paused for a moment, then unfastened her seatbelt and opened the door slowly. She stepped onto the gravel shoulder in her flats, the Sunday morning sun warm on her face, and stood still beside her own car on an empty stretch of highway where she had done absolutely nothing wrong. "Put your hands on the hood," Harkin said. She placed her palms flat on the warm metal without a word. What happened next was captured in full by the body camera mounted on Harkin's chest. He began a full pat-down search, running his hands along her sides, her waist, her hips, down both legs, a complete body search conducted on a public highway on a woman who had been pulled over for nothing and whose records had come back clean. Passing cars slowed as they went by. One driver visibly turned their head. Barbara stood still, her palms flat on the hood, and spoke without turning around. "Sheriff, I want you to know that I am a federal judge for the Southern District of Florida. This stop has no legal basis. You have conducted a search without probable cause or consent. Everything happening right now is being recorded by your own body camera." Harkin let out a short laugh. The body camera captured it clearly. The sound, the smirk that followed, the slight shake of his head. "Sure you are," he said, "and I'm the Pope." He stepped back and crossed his arms. "People like you always have a story, every single time." He looked at the Mercedes, then back at her. "That car's a little too nice for somebody coming from where you're coming from, don't you think?" Barbara turned to face him. Her voice didn't waver. "You are violating my Fourth Amendment rights. I am telling you clearly and for the record. I am a sitting federal judge. And this stop, this search, and that statement you just made are all being preserved on your own equipment." Harkin stared at her for a long moment. Then he unclipped his radio from his shoulder and called for backup. Deputy Kyle Jessup, 28, arrived in a marked cruiser 6 minutes after the call. He was young, barely 3 years into the job, and had learned early that when the sheriff asked for something, you didn't question it. He stepped out of his vehicle and walked toward Harkin, who was standing beside the Mercedes with his arms crossed and Barbara still positioned near the hood. Harkin spoke loud enough for the body camera to pick up every word. "I need you to search this vehicle. I'm getting a strong smell of marijuana from inside." The body camera footage would later become critical for one reason. At no point during the entire encounter did Harkin lean toward the car, lower his head near the window, or make any motion consistent with smelling anything. He never sniffed. He never gestured toward the interior. He made the claim while standing 4 feet from the vehicle with his arms folded. The fabrication was not subtle. It was lazy, and it was captured in high definition from his own chest. Jessup opened the driver's side door and began searching. He went through the glove box first, pulling out the registration sleeve, an insurance card, a small pack of tissues. Then the center console, a phone charger, a pen, a packet of mints. He opened her purse on the passenger seat and went through it item by item. Wallet, keys, a small Bible with a cracked leather cover. Then he moved to the trunk. Inside was a black garment bag, zipped and neatly folded. Jessup unzipped it and stopped. Inside hung a set of federal judicial robes, pressed and clean, with an official court ID badge clipped to the hanger. Beneath the garment bag sat a leather folder containing case files stamped in red, "Confidential, U.S. District Court, Southern District of Florida." Beside the folder, wrapped carefully in cloth, was a framed commendation from the Attorney General of the United States, personally inscribed to Judge Barbara Johnson for distinguished service to the federal judiciary. Jessup's face went pale. He looked at the robes, then the badge, then the commendation. He turned toward Harkin and held up the court ID without saying a word. Harkin walked over. He looked at the badge. He looked at the robes hanging from the trunk lid. He looked at the framed commendation. The body camera recorded every second of it. His expression didn't change. "Could be fake," he said. "People buy stuff like that online." Jessup stared at him. "Sheriff, this has a federal seal. This looks real." "I said it could be fake. We're not done here." What happened next would be replayed millions of times on screens across the country. Harkin walked back to where Barbara stood and told her she was being detained for further investigation. He reached for his handcuffs. Barbara looked at him and said, "You are making the worst decision of your career." He clicked the cuffs onto her wrists, one at a time, tightening them until the metal pressed into her skin. A 53-year-old federal judge now stood in handcuffs on a gravel shoulder in rural Florida, her car doors hanging open, her belongings scattered across the seats, her judicial robes draped over the open trunk for anyone passing to see. And people were passing. A white pickup truck slowed first. The driver, a man in his 40s, raised his phone and began recording through the open window. Then a red sedan behind him. Then a family in a minivan pulled onto the shoulder entirely, the mother in the passenger seat filming, while the father stepped out and stood watching from a distance, shaking his head. Harkin ignored them. He keyed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Sheriff Harkin. I have a suspicious individual on Route 15 near mile marker 14. Subject is in possession of what appear to be federal judge credentials, possibly fraudulent. Requesting verification." There was a pause on the other end. The dispatcher's voice came back carefully. "Say again, Sheriff?" Harkin repeated himself, word for word. Another pause, longer this time. Then the dispatcher spoke again, and anyone listening could hear the shift in her tone. "Sheriff, did you say federal judge credentials?" "That's correct. Send verification." The dispatcher didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice was flat and controlled, the kind of tone a person uses when they realize they are about to witness something they cannot stop. "Copy, Sheriff. Routing to the U.S. Marshal Service now." On the side of the road, Barbara stood still in the handcuffs, her wrists already reddening, her robes catching the breeze from the open trunk. She said nothing. She didn't need to. 3 phones were recording. The body camera was running. And somewhere on the other end of a radio frequency, the people who actually understood what had just happened were already reaching for their phones. 4 minutes. That's how long it took for everything Sheriff Bo Harkin had built over 11 years to begin collapsing. Dispatch routed the verification request to the U.S. Marshals Service, the federal agency responsible for the protection of the judiciary. Deputy U.S. Marshal Samuel O'Dara pulled the file in under 90 seconds. Judge Barbara Johnson, active status, Southern District of Florida, appointed by the President, confirmed unanimously by the Senate, 22 years on the bench, security detail on file. O'Dara called Harkin's radio directly. The body camera captured every word. "Sheriff Harkin, this is Deputy U.S. Marshal Samuel O'Dara. I'm confirming that Judge Barbara Johnson is a sitting federal judge in the Southern District of Florida. Her credentials are valid and not in question." Harkin shifted his weight. He didn't respond. "Sheriff, Is Judge Johnson in handcuffs right now? Silence. The camera caught his jaw tighten. Remove them. Immediately. Do not say another word to her. Your body camera footage is now subject to federal preservation. Nothing gets turned off. Nothing gets deleted. Do you understand me? Harkin walked to where Barbara stood and unlocked the cuffs without speaking. The metal had already left red impressions around both wrists. She brought her hands forward and rubbed the marks slowly, pressing her thumbs into the grooves left on her skin. She didn't say a word. She didn't look at him. Behind her, 3 bystanders were still recording. The woman in the minivan held her phone steady with both hands. The man in the pickup hadn't moved. A teenager in the back seat of the red sedan had already typed a caption and was uploading the footage before Harkin had even returned the cuffs to his belt. The silence on that roadside said everything. Then Harkin tried to recover. His posture changed. His voice changed. The body camera recorded the shift in real time, as if someone had flipped a switch inside him. Ma'am, I want you to know I was just doing my job. Standard procedure. Anyone in my position would have done the same. No disrespect intended. Barbara turned and looked at him for the first time since the cuffs came off. She didn't raise her voice. She stood exactly where she was, wrists still red, blouse creased from the pat-down, and spoke with the kind of quiet precision that comes from decades of hearing every excuse the law has ever produced. In 22 years on the federal bench, I have heard those exact words hundreds of times. I was just doing my job. Anyone would have done the same. She paused. Not once has it been true. Harkin's mouth opened, but nothing came out. I need your badge number, your full legal name, and the name of every deputy on scene today. I will not be filing a complaint, Sheriff. I will be filing a federal lawsuit. Do you understand the difference? He didn't answer. Jessup, standing near the cruiser, looked at the ground. Barbara walked to her vehicle. She replaced the items pulled from the console, closed the glove box, zipped her purse. At the trunk, she refolded her judicial robes along the original creases, placed the Attorney General's commendation back in its cloth wrapping, and closed the trunk with both hands. She pulled onto the highway without looking at him again. Harkin stood on the gravel watching the silver Mercedes disappear. And somewhere between that stretch of road and the nearest cell tower, 3 videos were already climbing, carrying with them the sound of a sheriff laughing at a federal judge and the image of a black woman in handcuffs beside her own judicial robes. Within 3 hours, the first video was live. Within 6, there were 4. By nightfall, the footage had spread to every major platform and was climbing faster than most accounts could track. The most viewed was filmed by Dorothy Vaughn, 67, a retired schoolteacher from Kissimmee who had been driving home from church when she saw the lights on the shoulder and pulled over. Her video ran just under 4 minutes and captured the full sequence. Barbara standing in handcuffs, the judicial robes draped over the open trunk, Harkin laughing, the deputies pulling items from the vehicle, and the moment Harkin's radio crackled with the marshal's voice and the cuffs came off. Dorothy uploaded the video with a single line of text. They handcuffed a federal judge on the side of the road because she was black. It reached 2 million views in under 18 hours. Florida news outlets picked it up first, then the national networks. Cable news ran the Bodycam stills side by side with Barbara's official judicial portrait. The same woman, the same face, one image in handcuffs on gravel, the other in robes behind a federal bench. Legal analysts called it one of the most egregious traffic stops ever recorded. Harkin's name trended nationwide before Monday morning. The Osceola County Sheriff's Office responded the only way it knew how. It made things worse. A spokesperson issued a written statement calling the stop routine and consistent with department policy. That statement landed like gasoline on a fire that was already burning through the news cycle. Journalists filed public records requests within hours. The traffic stop data that came back told a story the department had never intended to make public. Black drivers in Osceola County were stopped at 4.7 times the rate of white drivers. The disparity had held steady for years. It wasn't a glitch. It was a pattern. Former deputies began coming forward, anonymously, speaking to reporters under condition of protection. They described a department culture built on intimidation and racial targeting, one that started at the top. 3 deputies speaking independently revealed the same detail. Harkin had a phrase he repeated in briefings before Sunday patrol shifts. "Let them know who runs the road." One former deputy told a reporter that the phrase wasn't a joke. It was an instruction. And everyone in the department understood exactly what it meant and exactly who it was directed at. Internal Affairs opened a formal investigation. Harkin refused to cooperate. He released a statement of his own through a personal attorney, calling the investigation a political witch hunt, driven by media hysteria and anti-law enforcement bias. He expressed no regret. He offered no apology. He mentioned Barbara Johnson by name 0 times. The federal response came fast and it came heavy. Within 5 days of the videos going viral, the U.S. Department of Justice announced a formal pattern or practice investigation into the Osceola County Sheriff's Office under Section 14,141 of the Violent Crime Control Act. It was the same statute used to dismantle corrupt police departments across the country. The announcement made national news before lunch. FBI agents arrived in the county seat by the end of the week. They set up in a rented office space 2 blocks from the courthouse and began pulling everything. Traffic stop records, dispatch logs, body camera archives going back 5 years, personnel files, complaint histories, training bulletins. They interviewed current deputies, former deputies, dispatchers, administrative staff, and civilians who had filed complaints that went nowhere. What they found confirmed what the data had already suggested, and what Black residents of Osceola County had been saying for years. Sheriff Bo Harkin had personally conducted over 300 traffic stops in the previous 3 years alone. Of those stops, 84% involved Black or Latino drivers, despite those groups making up only 31% of the county's population. The numbers weren't borderline. They were staggering. But the most damaging discovery wasn't the stops themselves. It was the footage that should have existed, but didn't. Body camera recordings from 19 separate traffic stops had been deleted or listed as corrupted in the department's evidence system. Every single one involved a minority driver. Every single one had generated a formal complaint. And in every single case, the deletion had been logged under Harkin's administrative access credentials. 2 weeks after the DOJ announcement, Judge Barbara Johnson held a press conference outside the federal courthouse in Miami. She stood behind a podium in her judicial robes, composed and unhurried, and announced that she had retained one of the most prominent civil rights law firms in the country. She was filing a $34 million federal lawsuit against Sheriff Bo Harkin personally, Deputy Kyle Jessup, and the Osceola County Sheriff's Office. The complaint was 97 pages long. It alleged unlawful stop, unlawful search, unlawful detention, excessive force, racial profiling, violations of the First, Fourth, and 14th Amendments, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Attached as exhibits were the full body camera transcripts, all 4 bystander videos, the recorded radio transmission from Deputy U.S. Marshal O'Dara, the department's own traffic stop data, and sworn affidavits from 14 other Black motorists who described nearly identical encounters with Harkin. Same language, same tint excuse, same body searches on the shoulder, same sneering disbelief when they identified themselves or asked for a reason. Barbara read a single prepared statement. Her voice was steady, measured, the same tone she used from the bench. I have spent my career upholding the Constitution. On that roadside, the Constitution was not upheld for me. If this can happen to a federal judge, imagine what happens to those who have no robe, no title, and no camera watching. She took no questions. She stepped away from the podium and walked back into the courthouse. The cameras kept rolling on the empty podium for nearly a full minute before the feed cut. The collapse began with the youngest man on that roadside, Deputy Kyle Jessup, 28, had spent 3 years following orders without question. He had watched Harkin operate. He had participated in stops he knew had no basis. He had searched vehicles on fabricated probable cause and written reports that softened what actually happened. But facing personal liability in a $34 million federal lawsuit and the full weight of an FBI investigation, Jessup made the only decision that could save what was left of his future. He flipped. His sworn deposition ran 114 pages. He described Harkin's instructions in detail, the department culture, the unwritten rules about who to stop and where, the deleted body camera footage, the complaints that were buried before they could reach anyone outside the building. He named dates, he named locations, he named victims, and he described one briefing that would become the centerpiece of the federal case. A Sunday morning meeting where Harkin stood in front of 6 deputies and said plainly, "A black person in a nice car in my county is probable cause enough for me." 3 more deputies corroborated the statement independently. Same words, same briefing, same man. The county attorney reviewed the mounting evidence and quietly signaled willingness to settle the civil lawsuit. Harkin was suspended without pay the same week. But the civil case was no longer his biggest problem. A federal grand jury returned an indictment against Harkin under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. His mugshot was taken at the same county jail complex he had overseen for over a decade. He was photographed in a gray booking jumpsuit, the badge gone, the pressed uniform gone. The authority stripped down to a number on a placard. Every network ran the image before sundown. The settlement came first. Osceola County agreed to pay Judge Barbara Johnson $34 million to resolve the civil lawsuit, the largest civil rights settlement in the history of the state of Florida. The county commission approved it in a closed session that lasted less than 40 minutes. No one on the board asked to take it to trial. The evidence was too clear, the footage too public, and the liability too deep to fight. Then came the criminal trial. Federal prosecutors presented the body camera footage, the bystander videos, Jessup's deposition, the traffic stop data, and the testimony of 3 corroborating deputies. Harkin's defense argued that every stop was conducted under lawful authority and standard procedure. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours, guilty on 4 counts of deprivation of rights under color of law. Harkin was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. The judge who handed down the sentence noted that the defendant had used the power of his office not to protect the public, but to target members of it based on race, and had done so systematically over more than a decade. Jessup received a reduced sentence of 18 months in exchange for his cooperation. He would serve his time at a minimum security facility and be barred from law enforcement for life. The Osceola County Sheriff's Office entered a federal consent decree, the very outcome Harkin had avoided 2 years earlier through a quiet settlement. This time, there would be no quiet resolution. The decree required independent civilian oversight, mandatory bias training for every officer, a complete rewrite of traffic stop protocols, real-time body camera auditing with third-party access, and the creation of a civilian review board with full subpoena power. 4 additional deputies were terminated for participation in discriminatory enforcement. The department was placed under federal monitoring for 10 years. Judge Barbara Johnson returned to the bench on a Monday morning, 3 months after the settlement was finalized. She walked into her courtroom in the same robes that had been draped over the trunk of her car on a gravel shoulder in Osceola County. Her staff stood as she entered. Then the attorneys in the gallery stood. Then the clerks. No one had coordinated it. No one had planned it. The room simply rose. Barbara nodded once, sat down, and called the first case on her docket. She gave no interviews. She issued no celebratory statements. She made no television appearances, accepted no invitations to speak about the incident, and declined every request for comment from every outlet that reached out. She simply resumed doing the work she had done for 22 years, hearing cases, weighing evidence, and applying the law. but her words traveled without her. The single statement she had read outside the courthouse, "If this can happen to a federal judge, imagine what happens to those who have no robe, no title, and no camera watching," was reprinted in 4 major law reviews within 6 months. It was cited in congressional testimony during hearings on police reform, and it appeared in the written opinions of 3 subsequent federal rulings on law enforcement accountability, quoted by judges who understood exactly what she meant, because the system she described was the same one they worked inside every day. In downtown Orlando, a mural appeared on the side of a building 2 blocks from the federal courthouse. It showed Barbara in her judicial robes, standing upright beside a silver SUV with its trunk open and its contents scattered. Under the image, one line in block letters read, "The law does not bow to a badge." No one claims credit for the mural. No one needed to. The image spoke for itself, the same way the footage had. The same way Barbara had on that roadside, standing in handcuffs with her hands steady and her voice clear, telling a man with a badge exactly what was coming. This case was disturbing, but the one on the right ends in a way no one expects.
The precise records of our past hold the essential narratives that define our present reality. To deeply understand these narratives is to search for the absolute truth. Thank you for sharing in our steadfast commitment to uncover what truly happened.